At this point, I am super intrigued by these small nuances that separate the practices of the top performers from the lower performers. So let's get into a truly numbers driven category in Jeremy's maturity assessment: pipeline and forecasting.
No surprise here. I don't think this is rocket science, but the top two things I'll read the what appear to be best practices. So we have a large enough pipeline to achieve bookings goals in each period, given sales cycles and win rates. Is that cause or effect? You could argue both ways, but if you think about that, it's like maniacal dedication to pipeline. And then I think the second one is the one that is the input to the first one, which is we monitor and report on pipeline created per seller on a frequent, for example, weekly basis. And if I look at, there's one of the cool things about this new job I have is, I get to look across. We have 500 portfolio companies, so I get to look across tremendous amount of data and company performance. And the number one kind of success / failure factor is this one, from what I can tell. It's basically, am I from leadership down to first line managers holding reps accountable to pipeline production? And somebody had a counter argument with, on this, which is, okay, if you just demand more pipeline, what do you get? You get a bunch of crappy opportunities. So yes, you need to control for that, right? I think it is the pairing of making sure that pipeline gets created, but then also inspecting that pipeline to make sure that it's quality and qualified, pipeline, meeting the exit criteria, meeting the standards of your persona and ICP and all that. But as I said to the person that I was talking to, it's like, if you don't knock on the door, you're not going to sell any Girl Scout cookies, right? So you got to knock on the door, right? So and the door knock here is making sure that opportunities get injected into the top of the pipeline.
So the ops person in me can't help but want to open up that a little bit more and dig in a little bit deeper. So I've probably spent more time in a room arguing about pipeline attribution and who sourced this and whose job than I would care to admit, right? Just too much time over the years. And so I'm curious, completely agree with both of those statements and the fact that one leads to the other. In that maniacal focus about that pipeline created per seller, did you find or learn anything or from anecdotal from within the portfolio company about, what does that look like for new business versus existing customers? Or what does that look like for a rep versus their SDR or a marketing support? That's where I feel like the rubber hits the road. And that's also where, again, you can get stuck in finger pointing, or you can say, look, we're all responsible here. And so I'm just curious what you found.
I love that. And there's so much to unpack. And if we were, video cast or whatever it would be called, they'd see me smiling. And I'm smiling because one thing absolutely that I've seen successful, unsuccessful companies is that they are separating their new logo and their expansion pipeline. That's an absolute, I will say it anecdotally, right? I'll say it with conviction, but it's an absolute best practice. And I see far too many companies who aggregate the pipeline. Almost everybody does. In fact, it's rare to see that separated. It's very rare to see that they're to be separate targets. Sometimes for the entire company, they just don't think that way. And then certainly down to the manager or rep level, that's very rare to see the separation. And it's not even that you have to give the rep necessarily that explicit target, although there are some benefits to doing that. But to at least know what your targets are. And the reason this becomes a problem is the following, right? I'll see a portfolio company that has 140% NRR, right? They're just raging net retention growth. And that's masking the fact that they're not acquiring enough new logos. But the problem with even 140% NRR is that that's cohort based. And as companies mature as customers, right, when they're in their third, fourth, fifth year, they're probably no longer growing at, some extreme rate. And if you don't acquire enough new logos, then you hit a growth problem and you start to miss. And then it takes a long time, right? To recharge the new logo thing when everybody's focused on, reps in most cases will naturally focus on expansion. There are some company cultures and even like country cultures where the culture is like whatever, chest banging over acquiring new logos, and there's a pride in doing that. But mostly you go fish where it's easy to fish.
Sure. Path of least
So
resistance.
yeah, that's one thing I would unpack. I think the other best, like sub best practice that is within what you were saying was the best companies. This relates to attribution. The best companies are extremely thoughtful about sourcing pipeline. And I'm going to distinguish sourcing pipeline from attribution, right? It's like they have a waterfall that they say, for a given rep in a given segment, I know that a certain percent is going to be whatever product generated. I know a certain percent is going to be, demo request inbound driven by demand gen via paid sources. I know a certain percent is going to be outbound. I know a certain percent is going to be CSQLs, like whatever, right? Whatever the sources are, they have a targets waterfall target effectively to build up where those leads will become generated, by. I separate this from attribution simply because I ran at attribution as a CMO and I ran at attribution as a head of RevOps, and it's basically impossible, right? Like, I think you just choose something. You choose either first touch or last touch. I kind of like first touch a little better, but you could probably argue me into the other one. What I did try to do, because I'm a big effing propeller head, is I once tried to build, like a statistical model using logistic regression, to separate all the factors in attribution. And that was before there were tools, right, to do that. But even those tools, the data is just not good enough to do proper attribution. And I also just think nothing good comes of it. It's like I learned a good lesson from one of my bosses. He's when I'd done a massive retention analysis to figure out what factors drove retention for the company so we could prioritize our effort. And then this dude, he's one of the smartest people, if not the smartest person I've ever met. He did the work that led his professor to win the Nobel Prize in Bose-Einstein condensates. MIT physics PhD, like just ragingly brilliant. And he sort of sat back in his chair and he said, you didn't need to do all that work because we have enough capacity in customer success to touch every customer, with whatever was needed. So there was no need to actually prioritize the accounts. So anyway, this is my point of going back to attribution. It's like, even if you were able to do it, it's probably unnecessary, but definitely the waterfall contribution of pipeline by source is incredibly important because that helps you with budgeting and focus.